Thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. Happy Tuesday. The Republican Party pulled off a rare electoral feat in 1988 when they were able to elect a president from their own party after Ronald Reagan had just served his 2 terms as well. Usually voters are in the mood to turf out the party in power after a president from one party has been in there for a couple of terms. But in 1988, the Republicans beat those odds. Republican President Ronald Reagan had served for 2 terms. He was succeeded in office by his Republican vice president, by George H.W. Bush. He was elected in 1988. He was sworn in January 1989. And although both those presidents, both President Bush and President Reagan, will certainly have their place in the history books, the transition wasn't as easy as you might expect. The elevation from Vice President Bush to President Bush was a little bit rocky. In his first year, especially early on in his first year, he suffered in comparison with President Reagan, in particular when it came to his instincts around public communication and his handling of the press. Take, for example, this moment, just a few months after Poppy Bush became president. This was May 1989. He'd been sworn in January of that year. In May 1989, President George H.W. Bush decided to make a very controversial, very provocative, very bold public statement on foreign policy. But he did it in the most awkward, inexplicable way possible, which is exactly how the press reported it.
His aides said the situation in Panama was relatively quiet today and required no comment from the president. But Mr. Bush had a nagging feeling that he had not made his views on Panama clear, that the Panamanian people did not realize how much he hopes they will rise up against General Noriega. So, on Air Force One, Bush spoke out.
People should do everything they can to have the will of the people respected. They ought to heed the international calls. They ought to just do everything they can to get Mr. Noriega out of there.
Isn't Bush worried that he might inflame the situation? On second thought, would he urge the Panamanian people to be cautious?
No, I would add no words of caution. The will of the people should be implemented. Look, I'm not about to get into proposing a 3-point action plan for the people of Panama. You see, I do think it's important that it not be the United States, the Colossus of the North, coming down there to try to dictate to the people of Panama.
This was such a weird rollout of this position from the president, right? His aides tell the press, nothing's going on. There's nothing in particular that is driving this. The president was just doing this other thing. It was totally unrelated, and he had a nagging feeling. He had a feeling that maybe people weren't totally clear on how much he wants there to be a coup in Panama. So on Air Force One, he hopes there's a coup. He doesn't want the United States to be dictating what should happen, but he does want there to be a coup. And so he wants to summon all the reporters on Air Force One, apropos of nothing, for him to remind them how much he thinks that country should overthrow its leadership. Not that he thinks the United States should be dictating what happens there. What? Given that initially awkward rollout that day in May 1989, the new president decided that he would give the whole thing another shot the following day. But again, it was sort of 1 shot forward, 2 shots back.
The administration says it hopes the Panamanian Defense Force will follow President Bush's plea to rise up against Noriega. At a political fundraiser last night in Kentucky, Mr. Bush said he would act as much as possible in concert with other countries.
We do not want to return to the days of the imperialistic gringos of the North.
We're not here to be the imperialistic gringos. We don't want to be the Colossus of the North. We don't want to tell any country what ought to happen in their country, except in Panama, you guys need to have a coup. That was May 1989, the early awkward days of the George H.W. Bush presidency. By October of that same year, October 1989, though, in fact, Panama had a coup. At least they had an attempted coup. It did not go well.
Panama's General Noriega in control then and still in control now.
Good evening.
Panama's General Manuel Noriega is alive and well tonight, still in power after rebel troops tried to overthrow him in a day of heavy fighting. The shrewd and durable military strongman appeared tonight on Panamanian television and condemned the uprising. In the capital, Panama City, forces loyal to Noriega are in control. NBC's Brian Ross has been following all of this from Washington, and tonight, Brian, ultimately it was Noriega's forces who won the day.
Yes, Tom, American authorities say Noriega is much more powerful tonight after having so easily put down this morning's attack.
White House aides say they've known for a couple of days there could be an attempted coup, but that the president knew for certain only after gunfire erupted in Panama City. President Bush learned of the fighting just before he welcomed Mexico's President Salinas. During the ceremonies, Bush seemed distracted. Not only was Bush worried about the coup's chances of success, he also worried that Latin Americans would accuse the U.S. of throwing its weight around in a tiny Latin country. Bush later went out of his way to deny U.S. involvement.
There were rumors around that this was some American operation, and I can tell you that is not true.
Although Bush denied involvement, in the past he has urged Panamanians, especially the military, to rise up against Noriega.
But we'd love to see him get him out. We'd like to see him out of there.
Bush's aides do not believe that today's failure is George Bush's Bay of Pigs, the Cuban invasion fiasco that haunted John Kennedy. The Bay of Pigs was an American operation. Today's attempted coup was not, according to Bush's aides, say that although he urged a revolt, he never promised to help.
Anytime they're saying, now they don't think this is his Bay of Pigs. Like, anytime you have to reference that. Those reports are from October 3rd. That was the day of that failed attempted coup in Panama. Within a few days, this just continued to escalate and escalate and escalate domestically here until it became a full-scale political disaster for the relatively young George H.W. Bush White House.
Good evening. President Bush and his advisors are under fire tonight, charged with fumbling a chance to get rid of General Manuel Noriega during Tuesday's attempted coup.
President Bush took the unusual step of going to the Democratic leader of the Senate's office to assure George Mitchell that George Bush did not wimp out in the middle of the coup attempt. Later, NBC's Andrea Mitchell asked Bush if he got bad intelligence from his advisors.
No, I do not think so at all, and I don't think anybody up here thinks so.
President Bush knew he was in trouble when he read his morning newspapers. Caught off guard. Aides admit bad handling. Tragedy. Inexperience helped doom coup.
So that is how that unfolded over the first week in October 1989. George H.W. Bush's first year in office. Here's this new U.S. president who had been encouraging a coup in this foreign country in Panama for months, awkwardly encouraging it, having nagging doubts about whether he's been encouraging it enough. Right? Insisting on it at times, but still saying, I don't want to be telling you what to do, except that you should have a coup. When the coup finally comes to pass, the coup fails. The U.S. president appears to have not really known what he was talking about when he was begging publicly for that coup to happen, pledging there'd be all this U.S. support that never arrived. And then a week later, it's interesting, that whole story, which was very, very bad news for this new presidency, that whole story took a turn. It happened on Friday the 13th. October 13th, 1989, just exactly a week after that day of terrible headlines for President George H.W. Bush about him screwing up when it came to that coup in Panama. But October 13th, 1 week later, that was Black Friday. That was the day the stock market had a huge crash in 1989, one of the biggest crashes of the decade. But even alongside that huge crash, the new twist in the Panama crisis made news that night, too. In a huge, big new way because of this scoop on the front page of the LA Times. FBI gets okay for overseas arrests. That's the A1 headline in the LA Times. This is the subhead. The Justice Department's decision, which allows U.S. law officers to act without the consent of foreign states, could apply to efforts to bring Panama's Manuel Noriega to trial in Florida. So even with the huge, devastating stock market crash, that Black Friday, October 13th, 1989, there's also that weird scoop in the LA Times, which puts the disastrous Panama story back on the nightly news that same night. And again, yet another sort of almost ridiculously inept comment from the new president to punctuate it, because every time something comes up in this story, he just seems to stick his foot in it.
The FBI tonight has broad new powers to arrest American fugitives overseas. The Justice Department says permission is not needed from foreign countries. However, Secretary of State James Baker said this new procedure will not be used without a full discussion of the obvious foreign policy implications.
Mr. President, the LA Times is reporting today that the Justice Department has given the FBI the go-ahead to arrest fugitives in foreign countries without the foreign country's consent. Now, this reverses the Carter administration's policy. Can you tell us what led up to this event and perhaps...
No,
something to do with that since he's a fugitive? The FBI can go into Panama now?
I'm embarrassed to say I don't know what it is. I'll have to get back to you with the answer to your question. Marlon, you take care of it. I don't know what it is. I've not seen the LA Times report, so I'll just have to not comment until I do.
Marlon, do we get the LA Times here? What is this? I mean, here is this new president on shaky ground who's had a really big foreign policy, national security crisis in his first 6 months in office. Right? He has been ineffectually, non-committally saber-rattling for months about how he wants there to be a coup in Panama. He wants the leader there to be overthrown. The U.S. will be there. If the Panamanian people, if the Panamanian military just rise up and topple the leader, the U.S. will be there for them. After months of saying that and then not following through, including when they tried it, I mean, this was a shocking turn in that story, right? Here's the president's Justice Department saying, well, here's a plan B. If the whole coup thing doesn't work out because we can't quite get that together, well, then here's plan B. Here's something we believe we can do. We're going to proclaim under the law we can do it. U.S. law enforcement personnel, U.S. FBI agents, we're going to declare that they legally can just go into any other country, anywhere in the world, and arrest the leader of that country if the U.S. wants to. Therefore, you won't really need a coup. We'll just have the FBI do your coup for you. Anywhere. That was the LA Times' scoop that October. The Justice Department, acting with unusual secrecy, has given the FBI legal authority to apprehend fugitives from U.S. law in foreign countries and return them to the United States without first obtaining the foreign state's consent. The rule could apply to such cases as the U.S. effort to bring Panamanian strongman Manuel Noriega to trial. Quote, department officials refused to discuss the broad new grant of power, the legal grounds used to justify it, or even to acknowledge its existence. The Times noted that the refusal by Justice Department officials to discuss the ruling was puzzling at a legal level because the ruling wasn't classified. It, quote, does not carry a security classification. So why wouldn't they discuss it? Why wouldn't they even admit that it existed? I mean, the Times knew it existed. The LA Times was able to figure out both the title of that memo and its author. Its author, then Assistant Attorney General William P. Barr. Yeah, that guy. The same William P. Barr, who was the newly appointed Attorney General of the United States under President Trump. When he was Assistant Attorney General under George H.W. Bush, when he was running the Office of Legal Counsel at the Justice Department, he wrote and then tried to keep secret a very controversial legal opinion on this very controversial issue. I mean, the brand new Poppy Bush administration was contending with wave after wave of controversy and drama over this whole issue of Panama. This was one of the big waves in that controversy. A legal opinion which came to light a week after this failed coup, right? A legal opinion they were trying to keep secret, which seemed to imply that the U.S. now believed the FBI could send in its agents to remove a foreign leader from power anywhere in the world on our own government's own say-so without consulting any foreign government about the fact that they were going to do this. I mean, it was one thing for the president to be, calling for uprisings in other countries, promising support for those uprisings and then not delivering. It was another thing for him to be saying that the uprising from here on out wouldn't be needed because we'd just do it ourselves with our law enforcement guys. Congress, unsurprisingly, was concerned. They convened a hearing that was titled FBI Authority to Seize Suspects Abroad. William P. Barr, the author of that reported memo, was summoned to testify. He was asked by Congress to hand over this legal memo that he'd authored, which reportedly justified this kind of radical action that nobody had ever heard of before. William P. Barr did show up for his congressional testimony, but he refused to hand over the opinion that he had written that led to him being summoned to testify in the first place. This is from the transcript of that hearing. Mr. Barr, quote, although the content of the opinion, like other advice rendered by the Office of Legal Counsel, must remain confidential, I'm happy to share with the committee our legal reasoning and our conclusions. Before turning to these legal issues, I think it's important that the committee understand, and then he gets interrupted. Congressman Don Edwards, the committee chairman, interrupts. Mr. Barr, may I interrupt? Why does the opinion have to remain confidential? Is this a change in policy? We have a copy of other non-classified opinions. This is not a classified document. Mr. Barr says, he says, Mr. Barr, why are you withholding it from this committee? Barr then insisted it was the policy of the Justice Department that opinions like this must remain confidential. It does not appear at all to have been the broad-based policy of the Justice Department that such documents would remain confidential. But nevertheless, he insisted that was the policy that he was following. The committee chairman knew that he was asserting a confidentiality policy that didn't really exist, and he pushed it on it. Committee chairman pushed him. He said, quote, I understand that, Mr. Barr, but this is public business, the subject of much discussion in the United States. You are going to have to tell the public and the Congress sometime why you changed the rules on this arresting of fugitives overseas. William Barr responds, that's what I'm here doing. We have no objection to explaining our conclusions and our reasoning to the committee. I'm just not going to give you the document. I'll explain it to you. I'll describe what's in it. So here's Congress saying, this is a matter of intense public interest. This is the biggest scandal for this new president, right? There is reportedly a document within the Justice Department that is very relevant to our understanding of the conduct of this administration. It is directly on point for a matter of huge public controversy and political importance and geopolitical importance that directly affects the behavior of the President of the United States, which has not been stellar on this point. You have to show us this document that has been reported in the press, that has been described. You're now admitting that this document exists. Show us the document. William Barr says, I don't want to show you the document. But trust me, I will describe it to you. He actually says at the hearing, these are his words at that hearing in 1989, he says that instead of handing over the actual opinion itself, he will, quote, summarize the principal conclusions of the opinion. Summarize its principal conclusions. Where have I heard that before? Law professor Ryan Goodman, who's a former special counsel at the Defense Department, wrote up this historical account this week. Now that this same William Barr, this exact same guy, is handling the report from special counsel Robert Mueller in exactly the same way, refusing to hand over the document itself, and instead he's providing what he described with exactly the same words, his summary of principal conclusions. Right? That summary of principal conclusions is all we've got thus far from Barr. It's going to be followed Thursday morning this week by some sort of redacted, censored version of Mueller's report. It's been 25 days since Mueller handed his report in to William Barr, a matter of intense public interest, intense investigatory interest when it comes to this president and his administration and his campaign. We still only have William Barr's so-called summary of that document's principal conclusions. We still don't know what we're going to get in terms of a redacted version of Mueller's report from Barr on Thursday morning. But, you know, thanks to history, we do know what happened the last time William Barr asked the country and asked Congress to trust him, to trust his summary of principal conclusions while he simultaneously refused to release the underlying document itself. That is what he is doing with the Mueller report right now. That is exactly the same thing he did using exactly the same language in 1989 with his super controversial legal opinion that said the FBI could go into any country in the world and arrest any foreign leader and bring them back to the United States. It took a while for it finally to come out, but within a couple of years of that stonewalling testimony from William Barr, at the height of the Panama controversy in 1989, within a couple of years, the underlying document that gave rise to all that scandal that he said couldn't be released. Within a couple of years, that document did finally get released in full. Congress subpoenaed it. The Washington Post reporter Michael Isikoff got his hands on it. Ultimately, in the early years of the Clinton administration, that legal opinion that Barr had refused to release, said he would only describe it, it was just finally publicly printed in unredacted form. Because of that, because we can now see that, we now know, for the sake of informing our good judgment today and this week when it comes to William Barr, we now know that the last time he tried to get away with something like this in 1989, William Barr's summary of that document's principal conclusions bore no relation at all to what was actually in the underlying document. As Ryan Goodman puts it this week, quote, when the opinion, the real opinion, was finally made public, it was clear that Barr's summary had failed to disclose the opinion's principal conclusions. Barr's so-called summary, quote, omitted some of the most consequential and incendiary conclusions from the actual opinion, and there was evidently no justifiable reason for having withheld those parts from Congress or the public. Just as an example of the distance between what Barr said in his summary and what was actually in this document that he was purportedly summarizing, what he assured Congress in his summary was that the actual opinion, this controversial document that the LA Times had scooped him on, right, that they'd learned had existed, he said that the opinion was, quote, strictly a legal analysis of the FBI's authority as a matter of domestic law to conduct extraterritorial arrests. It is strictly about domestic law. Trust me, I'm not going to show you the opinion. I've decided I cannot show you this opinion. But this is my summary of what's in it, and I'm telling you it's strictly an analysis as a matter of domestic law, strictly. Then ultimately, we get the underlying document that he was refusing to release. And just, I mean, you don't want to go through all of it, just look at the subheadings in it. The effect of customary international law on the FBI's extraterritorial powers. Also, the president's constitutional power to authorize actions inconsistent with customary international law. Also, the status of the UN Charter and other unexecuted treaties and treaty provisions. My favorite, subsection F, international and foreign law and the Fourth Amendment. I mean, whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing that the Justice Department at one point held that the FBI could go arrest foreign leaders anywhere in the world, when it came to time for William P. Barr to explain that to Congress, to explain to Congress and the public what was in that document, he said this was strictly on domestic law. This was analysis strictly only about U.S. law. The whole thing actually turned out to be about international law. At least all of the controversial and incendiary and inflammatory parts of it were, but he left all of those out in his summary. That's the last time William P. Barr tried to issue a summary of principal conclusions to Congress and the public instead of handing over an actual document. And that previous experience in U.S. history with William P. Barr is part of the reason there are so many red flags flying everywhere about him refusing to release the Mueller report in full to Congress, about him writing his own summaries of what he says is in the Mueller report instead of releasing the summaries that Mueller's team wrote themselves about their own report. It's also the reason I think why there are just generally low expectations for whatever it is going to be released from Barr's office Thursday morning this week, as he has been involved in supervising this vague and ever-shifting redaction process that he appears to have invented on the spot once he received the Mueller report and got a look at what was in it. So we're going to speak with Ryan Goodman in just a moment about the implications of William P. Barr's past behavior here and what that tells us about what we're about to experience. But the fact that there are such low expectations for what's going to be released on Thursday morning, I think also puts the spotlight on two other prospects here, which may yet be influencing how Attorney General William Barr is heading into what he's going to do in 2 days. Number one, there's the question of Mueller. There's the question of whether or not Robert Mueller himself will be allowed to testify to Congress about what his findings were. I mean, separate and apart from whatever written document is released to Congress and the public, will Mueller be allowed to testify, to explain what his findings were? It's very interesting. Over these last couple of weeks, unexpected development. House Republicans, surprisingly, have been on the same side as House Democrats on the issue of Mueller testifying. Both the top Republican on the Intelligence Committee, Devin Nunes, and the top Republican on the Judiciary Committee, Doug Collins, they have both said since Mueller submitted his report 25 days ago that Mueller himself should be called to testify in Congress about the results of his investigation and his findings. So that will mean both the Democratic chairman and the Republican ranking members of both of those key committees have said they want Mueller testifying in Congress. Could that help? If this goes badly on Thursday morning, which I think everybody is expecting it to in terms of what is cut out of Mueller's findings, could testimony from Mueller meaningfully fix that? Could it meaningfully assuage concerns in the country about what Barr has cut out of Mueller's written findings, if Mueller's allowed to testify on his own terms as to what he found? That's one. Then there's also the judicial process, and this has not had nearly as much attention, but we know that the Judiciary Committee is going to subpoena the full document after they see what's been redacted out of it. But there's another way that judicial proceedings matter here, not just in terms of what Congress might be able to get through the courts using the subpoena process. There's another way in which the judiciary here might matter. Today, there was a hearing on a FOIA lawsuit, a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit by BuzzFeed News. A number of media entities and First Amendment entities are seeking to release the full unredacted report. Today, in a hearing on one of these FOIA motions, a federal judge, a George W. Bush appointee named Judge Reggie Walton, he suggested in open court today that whatever William Barr redacts from Mueller's report, that may be subject to his review as a judge who's considering these FOIA requests. That judge today suggested in court that he personally may need to look at the entire unredacted Mueller report himself to decide if Barr's redactions from that report are proper under the Freedom of Information Act, or if those things that Barr is redacting from that report ought to be released to the public too. That's important, right? That's important not only for what might happen down the line in terms of those FOIA lawsuits, it's important in terms of what William Barr might do next. Because the bottom line here is that William Barr got caught once before not telling the truth about an underlying document that he said couldn't be released. He purported to summarize it. He put out a purported summary that did not at all match that document that he tried to keep secret. Well, the Mueller report may never be kept secret in the long run either. There are multiple paths by which the full unredacted Mueller report may ultimately see the light of day. Some of them controlled by Congress, some of them controlled by the judiciary, some controlled by unforeseen factors that we don't know how U.S. history is going to wrap around in the future. But if Barr is going to try this week to get away with selling some version of Mueller's findings that is not a truthful representation of what Mueller actually found, he will likely be caught for that, just like he was before. That is what history tells us, and that has to loom over what he is planning on shoveling to us on Thursday morning. We'll be right back.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.